In a previous video, we talked about the distinguishing characteristics of these two words at the top, perceiving and sensing. I'm going to just switch them around on the screen so that the sensing is on the right and perceiving is on the left, though we shouldn't mistake the meaning that we've gotten from those two words and earlier readings. When we sense things, we're taking them in through our senses, like that big eyeball, though I should really draw ears and our fingers and a sense of touch, taste, smell. I'll just use the eyeballs to try and help us understand that. That's where we're just taking in information. We're looking at the colors, we're looking at the color of the stem, we're looking at the shape. And of course, perceiving involves the second step of trying to connect that to things that we have in our brain. And there's a nice big picture of our brain that we can sense. It's sensing first, perceiving second. Perceiving helps assemble and compile the pattern of senses that we're getting into some manageable, distinguishable, identifiable form where we can put it back in our brain in long-term memory. We make the distinction here because there's quite a bit happening here that we take for granted all the time. And we're trying to make a distinction between several different things happening at once. When we see a red object with a green stem and the little vine sticking out of it, just like this, we recognize it as a tomato. Even its pronunciation is recalled to us. And we're recognizing it because we're connecting it through our perceptions to the brain. Right? Tomatoes people have seen before. No big deal there. We're just assimilating new information. This tomato we have not seen before, but we've seen tomatoes before, so it shouldn't be a surprise to us. But a star fruit? Of course, I'll have some expert students in class who have seen every fruit imaginable. And if it's not star fruit for you, it's probably something else. Something that you haven't seen before. And there you have to make an accommodation for something new. You have to connect it in your brain with a whole new room, a whole new file, so that you recognize this is a new thing, even though it fits into the bigger fruit category that you've got in your head. Maybe you don't even know that when you first see it. It just looks kind of like a star. And we make the comparison with what's called a simile, like or as. It is like a star if we turn it on its side, or its yellow is like a banana. And that's what we're doing when we're accommodating. We're connecting it to those experiences that we've had before, though this thing's totally new. Even the very word frontal lobe I put there. We put it on our little screen here because even as we're taking into account this picture of the brain that looks rather, I think, ready for the nursing or pre-med class, you're connecting it to an idea you have in your head of a frontal lobe. We haven't experienced that except probably through some media. Thank goodness. We haven't seen one ourselves, but that's what we're attaching as a label to it through perception. Now, connecting it to the assignment. This is all very abstract. If we're doing the assignment right, you will go from having the words to describe the place and not having the words and back again. It really should be back and forth, and I've talked about this in other videos. I want to now try and connect it to the reading that we just had on Malcolm X, because there are some lessons here that we can take to heart. Malcolm X's reading is about a prisoner. We're not prisoners, except in class. Malcolm X's reading is dated in part because it happened in the 1900s and we're in the 21st century. So how can that relate to us? How can that teach us a lesson about today's day and age? Well, of course, my field has all sorts of readings that date back historically quite a long ways. And they teach us lessons, they give us insights, they suggest things about human nature and about culture. So there are some things true about Malcolm X, even in a day and age when people whip out their smartphone and look things up that way. Malcolm X says in our reading that there are some things that are worth knowing. They're worth putting in that frontal lobe. They're worth putting in long-term memory. Or I suppose if you want to know, they're worth putting in the language centers, the Broca centers of our brain, the Broca's brain they call it, without having to look them up. Language really does help us, if we take it to heart, describe things better, spontaneously, and even allows us to notice things more. And hence, more vocabulary, the better. It doesn't mean that we have to have flowery language again. It's meaning that we're picking those words up all the time. I've used the example for years of my broken foot. When I went into the clinic with my broken foot, I didn't want the nurse who wanted to look up all the names of the bones in the foot to see which one of mine were broken. She had to know the name ahead of time, and really the family of different bones and the names surrounding those. I wanted her to know them. And we should too. We should in our own professions pick up new vocabulary all the time so we can apply it and not have to spend our time looking up the vocabulary or really the concepts that we're trying to apply in our professions. There's a Professor Stilgo who says that noticing things enriches the stuff of knowing. And that's true for concepts, never more true for concepts when you think about it. Words give us things to know and see, and consequently dictionaries and dictionaries like Malcolm X's, where he's looking up words, give us an insight into the culture. They give us a picture of our time, which I'm not exaggerating. It's not hyperbolic speech there. I think that that is a key insight that Malcolm X shows us, that we can get a picture of what our time is like and what history is like. Put in another way, dictionaries are the observation description assignment for the language. Now think about that just for a second. That means that they observe how people use the language and describe it for us so that we can use the language and be made sense of too, so that what we say is not misunderstood or doesn't detract from what we're really trying to communicate. That our language in our writing and our speaking doesn't attract attention negatively for how we misuse things or how we use things in ways that people will not understand. We use them and we observe how they're used in the culture, how they're used daily among people who use the language, so that we are well understood, so that people understand and can connect with our ideas. We're really picking up new language all the time. In another video I've made mention of the fact that we should really be doing this. Most of my students come into class knowing they want to do this, but not really sure, they're not really sure oftentimes how they can. Well, let's go into detail about how that can happen. There are lots of different kinds of definitions. There are definitions of definitions, which is what we're doing right now. Again, we're describing how the language works, and the people who put together dictionaries, lexicographers, that's their big long name, which you won't see except in one instance on a quiz where I'll define it for you. The kinds of definitions matter. There are ones that are found in dictionaries. There are ones that are defined for us, including the denotative definition. That means the literal definition of a term. If I'm talking about, for example, a mother-in-law, I'm talking about the mother of my wife. That's who I'm talking about. Whereas the connotation, which is the spirit or emotion or association that a word has, might be positive or negative depending on the phrase. If I say I'm going to my mother-in-law's, that means I'm going to go see the mother of my spouse. But if I say, oh, I'm going to go see my mother-in-law, we recognize instantly that what we're really talking about is a negative connotation, a strong negative connotation associated with mother-in-lawhood. Probably unfairly, too, because there are a lot of mother-in-laws who probably don't like the fact that they are viewed stereotypically along with this connotation associated with mother-in-law. And yet, there it is. That's the association. It's rather old-fashioned, actually. Denotation and connotations, usually found in good dictionaries. They'll give them both to you. Denotation, the literal definition of the word. Connotation, the associations of the word. There are, of course, other kinds of definitions, scientific definitions, where we get into the very specific language. Let's go back to the bones in the foot. There are ones found in professional dictionaries, including medical dictionaries, business, law. Whatever profession you go into, you'll have to use the specialized language of that profession. That means that other people who've been trained in the paralegal, in the medicine, in the nursing, in the business, in any specific profession, you'll need to understand the language that is commonly used in that profession. Those are the ones that can be found in the dictionaries. Okay, and then there are others. We can talk about the ones not found in the dictionaries because they usually fall into several different genres or types of kinds of definitions. There are stipulative ones that to which your listener stipulates at the time. You agree to it. You understand it and agree to it. We engage in those all the time. Even in the context of this class, it's very clear what a syllabus means in this class because I've given you an example of it. It has a specialized meaning. In your work, you probably have specialized definitions all the time. One of my very first jobs was working in a restaurant, and we oftentimes talked about how we had to fill a deuce or clean the foretop, and that language, which is the language of restaurant work, means simply that we're trying to work with a table for two or a table for four, and the language goes on because it's specialized for the profession. My wife now works in computers, and she'll work on the Napa system, or she'll work on the Blue computer system. All the people at her work know what they're talking about. I certainly don't because I don't work at her work. But the idea is that when you stipulate to something, you are in agreement with that community about what that word means. That can even affect, say, leases that we sign for contracts, say for an apartment or for a car. It'll say on that contract, the leasee is this person, the leaseor is that person. And we don't really read much into it until something bad happens. We have to turn to that contract to see if we're protected, and then we're very concerned about how those definitions work. It's a little bit like what Hamlet calls dagger definitions, because the definitions do matter. Now let's get into other definitions that might not be found in the dictionary, but we can still talk about them. Inventive definitions, personal definitions, poetic, philosophical, persuasive definitions, where someone's trying to persuade you of a way of thinking about something. Well, I would say that a very personal definition happens in the reading of Malcolm X, and because he's such a good writer, he can convey what it means like to be free even though he is in prison. And I love that contradiction. It seems like a contradiction. He's in prison, but he's never been so truly free. That's a personal definition, and we get it, because it's a different kind of freedom than being able to walk out on the street, being able to buy what you want to buy, being able to be with whom you want to be with, being able to go to sleep when you want to. He has never been so free, even though every part of his day is dictated to, even though he's got to do certain things all day long. He's never been so truly free, he says, as when he is in a book and reading by the light of the hallway. It's a freedom of mind, of course, a freedom of thought, freedom to be able to learn and also be able to express himself. There's several different freedoms really wrapped up into that big definition of freedom that aren't really commonly talked about necessarily in the dictionary, at least not talked about in the way that Malcolm X talks about them, in the paradoxical or contradictory way, because Malcolm X is still stuck in prison, of course. Okay. Let's think about those kinds of definitions. I think it does help to think about language and the word concepts that we have here, because as Malcolm X teaches us, there are some things that are simply worth knowing, so that when we encounter that new thing, the star fruit, the frontal lobe, let's take some more conceptual language, the freedoms, the justice, the fairness. If we take more conceptual terms, we definitely want to know how people have defined those terms. Sometimes people spend their lifetime defining those terms. If you're in medicine, it's health, but it's also other words related to that too. Illness. In law, I've already given a hint that it's the freedoms, the justice that we seek. The abstract concepts that we add to our new knowledge every day are things that we kind of know are worth knowing. We don't need a smartphone or something to look them up instantaneously. Or if we do, we're adding to our new knowledge all the time because it enriches the stuff of knowing. It lets us look out into the world and be prepared to look for fairness, for justice, for health. Okay, we take it for granted, but I think that there's no small matter here of taking a new vocabulary. And if we set as a personal goal to add to our vocabulary, there are lots of things that I can suggest, and I'll probably go over them in class, of the methods by which people usually add to their vocabulary and increase their word hoard, their storage of language, so that they can not only summon precise language to describe things, but they can also notice things more.